evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a couple of weeks since we met because we thought we'd take a little break during the summer. So we are privileged to start the post-summer season with two distinguished people on the panel here and our great author, Mr. Abhyankar. Before we start, I'd like to just make one small request. If you have phones, if you could please put them either on silent or the vibrator mode, just as a mark of respect to the speakers. Greatly appreciate that. Thank you, and with that, Ambassador Chandra, over to you, please, for the rest of the program.
Thank you. Rajan, Palomi, members of the diplomatic corps and the press corps, friends, I'm indeed very thankful to Aspen Institute India and to the publishers for giving me this opportunity. I must say that when I was first asked to do whatever I'm supposed to do today, I was very hesitant and reluctant. But on going through the book which was given to me, I felt somewhat more qualified, as I would explain. It is not very common for the career paths of IAS and IFS officers to intersect very frequently. But in the case of myself and Abhyankar, it started more than 30 years ago. I was suddenly made chief executive of a sinking public sector company which had got into trouble in many Gulf countries. One of them was Iraq, where Abhyankar was there, so I used to visit him quite often, and we gave him a lot of trouble. In fact, he almost got shot on the streets of Iraq trying to persuade workers of NPCC and EPI to stay on during the Iran-Iraq war. And as he was speaking to them with encouraging words, a couple of planes appeared and strafed the streets right between the speakers and the workers. And you know what transpired later. I think everybody had to be saved with the help of Iraqi police. There were many other incidents which happened there, including my committing a faux pas in one of the offices of the ministry when I asked my regards to be conveyed to Minister Ghanim Abdul Jalil. And I got a curt reply that Mr. Jalil is not available. So I asked Abhyankar on my way out that he was rude, wasn't he? He said, no, he wasn't rude, he was just frightened because Jalil had been executed last week by Saddam Hussein. And he didn't want to answer that question. Well, next, I was sent to Sri Lanka as advisor to the Sri Lankan government. And I was going on merrily. I saw the situation deteriorate in 81, 82. But by that time, Rajendra and Palomi came, and my lonely life was suddenly improved because they were just half a kilometer away from me in residence. And I must say that in July 83, I left Colombo on a private visit just 2 days before all hell broke loose in Colombo. And there is a very vivid account in the book as to what the acting High Commissioner and his staff faced for a few days, till the Sri Lankan government could mobilize the army and other agencies to provide adequate security. So these two intersections, and then finally when I was in Washington, I was able to persuade him to leave his job as head of mission in Turkey and come to San Francisco, which had become very important to India-US relations. And he has described this very vividly in his book. I must say this book is quite unique in the sense that it's not a usual memoir of a retired civil servant. it is divided more by issues and situations. And I was really gripped with the account that he has given of unusual situations, unusual encounters, unusual adventures, and just the correct amount of description of leaders, the historical setting to make all the anecdotes come alive. And it's a very gripping account of how the journey of Indian diplomacy, which I always call a journey characterized as triumph of faith over experience. But I think we have come a long way, and those of you who get the chance to read this book will find it very rich in content. I will leave Rajendra to describe the book in greater detail, some of the highlights. But I must say that two things I discovered. One, that although we have known each other for over 30 years, he has not shared some of the most important events and been very reticent about his achievements, which is very unusual in civil servants. So I, for one, keep guessing a lot, anything happens. And the second is that the way events are described, it is described more or less, although he was a key actor in most situations, but he's not pushed himself forward and has allowed the facts to speak for themselves. In that sense, I think the book has some unique features. And I feel it will be a great asset to all those who have joined the diplomatic service. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Now? Oh, I thought he... So, one each.
Sir, thank you very much for such generous praise. I want to also thank all of you, my friends, for having come. I hope that you were tempted to come by the title of the book, and I hope it lives up to whatever you think Stuff Happens is all about. I wanted to actually say that, or again repeat, that it is not really an autobiography or a memoir. I have taken specific instances from my career which I thought would be of interest to others, and which may have had some small iota of influence on how foreign policy on that particular issue developed. Though that is the criteria that I have kept in mind in selecting the different events in my career, I have entirely relied on my memory. I have not consulted any files and have tried to steer away from needless controversy, though it's possible some of it may generate controversy. But I've also tried to concentrate on the unusual in my career. I mean, that has been a very important part of what I've tried to do. Because as a diplomat, I mean, all of us who have been diplomats, you come across a large number of events which are unusual when you look at it in a broad perspective. So I tried to take such events, and not what is probably run-of-the-mill, though for a diplomat, nothing is ever run-of-the-mill. And the interesting thing so I've tried to highlight unusual encounters, unusual situations, unusual adventures, unusual places, unusual experiences, and unusual people. The interesting thing, as I have written in the book about the unusual, is that unusual encounters happen without warning. Unusual adventures have to be created. Unusual situations develop. Unusual places are waiting to be discovered. And unusual people are with you all the time. The trick is, as you go through life, to be able to intuitively decide who are these people or what are these issues. So if I have to quickly go through all these different things, in unusual encounters, I'll highlight one or two. There are quite a few. One is my, surprising and unusual demand that was made on me to interpret for Indira Gandhi in 1976, interpret in French, when the then Commerce Minister of France, Raymond Barre, was coming to Delhi to prepare the visit of the then Prime Minister Chirac. Later, of course, Barre became Prime Minister and Chirac became President. But that was a very crucial time in our history. It was right in the middle of the emergency. And no Western leader had come to India in 76, after the declaration. And this was going to be the first major Western leader coming to India. So it was invested with a great deal of importance. And for me, as a young deputy secretary, to be thrown, and not an interpreter, to be thrown into this particular situation was not just unusual, it was incredible. I couldn't really adjust to it, but there was no choice. And most of you probably know that Indira Gandhi did speak French, but she had told me that she would let me know when she wanted me to interpret. And she had also told the director of her office that she didn't want an interpreter from the ministry. There were a large number of them. But she wanted a foreign service officer who could speak French. I tried to get out of it by saying I don't speak it that well, but couldn't manage. So there is an account of that. It was a 55-minute session where there was just Raymond Barre, Mrs. Gandhi, me as the interpreter, and the director of the office. And it was absolutely incredible the way she handled it and the things she said. And this is where I'll just highlight that at one point, the difference came out between an interpreter and a foreign service officer. An interpreter, most of whom are trained either for simultaneous or consecutive interpretation, just listen to what they hear and spout it out exactly in similar words, sometimes even keeping to the nuance and the tonal quality. But for a foreign service officer, all these things, we are not trained for it. So at one point, Mrs. Gandhi became extremely emotional when asked why she declared the emergency. That was the big question. And she became very emotional to really compare the situation in India, what it would have been, to what happened in Bangladesh when Mujibur Rahman and his family were killed. So she said it in a very angry and personal tone. And to me, instinctively, I said, I can't let my Prime Minister be seen like this. So I translated this in the third person, instead of doing it in the first person, which is what an interpreter would have done, to just soften the way she had said what she did. She heard me out, and then she said, now tell him exactly what I said. So that's one encounter. There are many such, but I'll jump from Indira Gandhi to Saddam Hussein. I think I was the last senior official to meet Saddam Hussein on 6th July 2002, which was a few months before everything finished there. And luckily for me, I was accompanying the oil minister, but a lot of the conversation took place between me and Saddam Hussein. We had luckily two interpreters, one who was doing Arabic to English and the other one who was doing English to Arabic. With my some knowledge of Arabic, it was a great opportunity because I could actually write verbatim the entire thing for my notes. And I found that here was a man I'm not holding a brief for Saddam Hussein, but just want to give you a sense of what was happening. At that time, the Western press was full of stuff that Saddam was out of touch with reality, didn't know what was happening, all that kind of thing. Here was a man who had no such thing. He was perfectly attuned to what was going on. And if you will recollect, this was 2002. We were in the middle of doing our bit of coercive diplomacy against Pakistan after the attack on our parliament in December 2001. And we had massed our armies on our border, and they were waiting there for the next many months. So Saddam Hussein, I remember, he said, tell your prime minister not to take the next step, because once he does, the enemy will know his strength. He said, that is what happened to me as far as Iran is concerned. So, you know, about the Iraq-Iran war. And another statement I remember, which I just want to recount here, is that he said, you know, we have always been with India. We have told Pakistan not to use the flag of Islam against India. I mean, this is the president of Iraq saying, and he, of course, like all such presidents, or many of them, was using the royal we. When he meant we, he meant him. I was actually recently greatly, not just taken aback, but happy that when Salman Khurshid recently visited Baghdad and we connected with Iraq after a whole decade, since 2003, the present government of Iraq has taken the same position, that India is really a non-partisan issue as far as the... So anyway, that's Saddam Hussein. The other interesting character I'd like to just mention is Willie Brown, the mayor of San Francisco. It was said that he was highly sartorially elegant. He believed that he must change his clothes at least twice a day, and he always had a hat of a different color, a felt hat. But what was important was he had this practice of issuing proclamations at the drop of a hat. And that proclamation you find here at the back. He issued a proclamation declaring 9th of May as Consul General Abhyankar Day in San Francisco. So, I mean, what could be more unusual? Actually, Brown is now no longer in politics, but he writes a column in the San Francisco Herald. And one of my friends from San Francisco, whom had sent the just the notice of this event, sent me back saying, why don't you tell him to highlight this, what you've written about him in his column. So I intend to do that. But anyway, that's the other interesting people whom I'd like to mention are my meeting with Talabani and Barzani, when I went there to actually see on the ground what was the possibility, if at all ever there was one, of India helping the United States with 15,000 troops for the north of Iraq. That is 2 months after the fall of Baghdad. That was an incognito visit, but I can say it now. Anyway, those are some encounters. Adventures. One was watching whales off the coast of Trincomalee. It is an extremely unusual thing. And Naresh ji was with me. And I think you still have possibly the photograph of the whale.
Lying somewhere. And also the race of the dolphins.
That's right. And the race of the dolphins as we were coming back. Incredible. And off Trincomalee is the only place where you can actually go and see whales and get within 100 meters of them, because they come there to beach. Nowhere else in this part of. This other interesting example was going up with my wife to Mount Moses up in the Sinai. And there are a few others. Interesting situations, 2 of them, Ambassador Chandra has already mentioned. One was 27th of September, 1980, when I nearly got killed in Baghdad. The other was 23rd July, 1983, in Colombo, when all hell broke loose there when the ethnic riots started. These are 2 unforgettable days in my... The third, of course, was my testimony for the prosecution in the Rajiv Gandhi trial at Siriperambudur after his assassination. As Joint Secretary, I was responsible for our relations with Sri Lanka, and my testimony actually was about the motive for the murder. So although I was not involved in other nitty-gritty, but this was an important testimony. I was cross-examined for 18 hours by 10 lawyers. We have 21 accused. And what came out was that all of them had been given state aid, state legal aid, because they had all said they didn't have the money. But their line of questioning, if you actually go through it, you will see that I think they had a retainer from the LTT as well. And this became very clear when at the end of about 10 hours of the thing, Murugan, who is the highest ranking LTT official we have in custody and he's sentenced to death, though he's still there in the jail in Vellore, Murugan asked me that wasn't there another country where Rajiv Gandhi sent Indian troops? Now, the point here that he was trying to prove by asking this was to cast reasonable doubt. And I had been told by our prosecuting counsel that under no circumstances should he get a chance to cast reasonable doubt, because then the judgment could not have been equivocal. So I refused to answer that question. I had also been told you will not use that power you have. There is a clause under which you can say that I refuse to answer in the public interest. But I was told don't use it again and again because they'll use it to debunk the rest of your testimony. So I was creating a fine line, but at this point I said no. Next day, Mr. Murugan doesn't come to court at all. So when I checked with the head of the SIT, that thing, because I was then holding the job of ambassador in Damascus, so I had a job to do. So I said, I can't hang around till this gentleman feels better. When I checked, I was told he got a medical certificate from the jailer that he was not well. So I said, well, even the LTT has penetrated your own medical service. How could he get he was fine yesterday evening. Then I had to go to the judge and say that, listen, I want to go back because I can't wait. He said, go ahead. We'll call you back when he comes. The only thing is he has delayed the trial for 8 months on one reason or another. So let's give it one more day. But at that time, if you read the questions and answers, you'll find it is really a travesty of justice that I was a joint secretary, so I'd call myself a senior official of the government, being interrogated in court by a high-ranking LTT official on Government of India's entire Sri Lanka policy. I came to Delhi on my way back to Damascus, had taken a copy of the testimony till that time, and asked the then Foreign Secretary that you should get a legal opinion whether I should be so doing. But eventually the legal opinion was that yes, there is no choice because otherwise Murugan will claim that the trial was flawed. So anyway, I went through those things. But what was interesting in the entire question answer is the tremendous pathos that comes out about Tamil rights in his questions, many of which I could not answer because I did not want to, for the reason that I was defending one particular line. But anyway, I don't want to carry on. I just want to say that among the unusual places is, of course, my first stop was as non-resident consul general to San Marino, 60 square kilometers. And I said, India on one side, San Marino on the other side, what can I possibly do here? And one day I was walking around and found next to the casino, which had then been closed, a small square called Piazzale Gandhi. So I said, good, I can at least put one statue of Gandhi here, which was done. So then the other very interesting and unusual place, I mean there are many, but is Gallipoli, where where large number of Indian troops died, so did a large number of Australians and New Zealanders and all that, in Churchill's desire to outflank and come through Turkey behind Germany. It didn't work. It was a tremendous defeat. But it is the only defeat I know of this magnitude which actually strengthened, had much more positives, because that campaign in Gallipoli actually strengthened the resolve of the Australians and the New Zealanders, who till then were taken as sort of second-class soldiers by the Brits. This time they really stood and fought. And till today, Anzac Day, 25th of April, is a national holiday in both countries. For Turkey, Ataturk was on the other side. That is from where he became then general and eventually the Big Turk. The other interesting places I'd also mention are is a comparison between the Umayyad Mosque and the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. Both are incredible places. They have been seats, I mean, they have been holy ground for over 2,000 years. So I feel how is it that everybody keeps going to the same place? There must be something about the place itself that makes, and if you see the Umayyad Mosque, it started as a Greek temple, then a Roman temple, then a Jewish temple, then a church, and then a mosque. But none of it was erased. You can see the signs, and if I ever get a chance to take you, I can show you the signs of each of these developments. And sometimes, and Nehru had a similar comment to make on his visit to Turkey in 1961 when he saw Hagia Sophia, where he writes that in his wisdom, Ataturk decided to make Hagia Sophia a museum, that there will be no worship either by Muslims or Christians there. And one wonders, why couldn't something like this have been done about Babri Masjid? So anyway, I thought it has some relevance too. And there is a whole chapter on Iraqi tales. I'll just mention one, which is about ham radios. You know that Rajiv Gandhi was a great ham radio fan. I even have his ham radio call sign. When Saddam invaded Kuwait on the 2nd of August 1990, for 10 days there was no contact between ministry and our ambassador in Kuwait because everything had been cut down. 10 days later, sitting in Cyprus where I was ambassador, I was called by someone saying that I'm getting a call sign on my ham radio that there's an Indian ambassador wanting to talk to any ambassador in the region. It turned out to be Arun Budiraja, and we talked, and that's the first information we got that the Indian community in Kuwait was safe. Mujkun Dubey used to be foreign secretary. I remember at night phoning his office, and next day Gujral, then foreign minister, made a statement on the floor of the house, and all the pressure from Kerala was relieved because majority. So, but this had a sequel. After that ham radio, years later, when I went to Damascus as ambassador, in my office when I was being taken around, there was a small little box in one corner. I said, what is that? I said, that's a ham radio. We are all supposed to know how to work a ham radio. Nothing ever happened. I think many missions were given this. This is the kind of stuff that happens. And then in 2001, when I was talking to the Indian community in Dubai, one Mr. Matthew, I think, came to me and he said, you know, you spoke to me first because it was my ham radio which was operating in Kuwait. So that was the full circle of all this stuff that went on. There's also something about the Awadh bequest. As you know, Warren Hastings took the money from the Begums of Awadh. They had said that this money should be used for Shia scholars going to Baghdad, to Najaf and Karbala. And we were doing that even long after none of these. There was no British Empire, there was no Begums of Awadh, there was no money, nothing. But on people, I'll just mention three. One is A.B. Nathan, who migrated to Israel in 1948, but was in the Indian Air Force, then was in the Israeli Air Force. He actually was in the Air Force when the 48 Kashmir thing took place, 47, and then 48 in Israel, in the Israelis' war in the Middle East. Then became a peacenik and had a ship, many of you may have heard of it, called the Voice of Liberty, which used to go up and down from Cairo to Beirut, broadcasting messages of peace in Arabic and Hebrew and all that. A.B., there's a story about how I got to know him, and my last meeting was with him in Damascus when I was ambassador, when he was really turfed out by the Syrians. The second is Ihab Sharif, an outstanding Egyptian diplomat who was my neighbor in Damascus. Then was, and he was a PhD from the Sorbonne, absolutely proficient both in language and in photography, in French and English. He had done a book on making the EU understandable to the Arabs. So I said, why don't you do a book on India? Which he did, unfortunately. I mean, that's a long story. The book saw light of day only 6 years later, finally when I was able to push it when I came back here. The book is there, absolutely Because I found that in Arabic, most of the writing on India is either translated and betrays the mindset of the translator many times. Because the basic word of matafi, that is, these are idolaters, always finds a place. So you can't have an objective book in Arabic unless it is written by an Arabic, for an Arabic who has the correct vision. And that was what Yab Sharif was. Poor fellow was sent off to Baghdad by Hosni Mubarak because he was under tremendous pressure to send ambassadors to Baghdad after the fall of Baghdad. Baghdad, yes. And Ihab got sent there as a CDA to become ambassador. Within 1 month, he had been kidnapped by the insurgents and killed. So that is Ihab. But an outstanding thing, you should read what he has written about India with great feeling. Some of it I put there. And of course, finally, a local employee called Saleh Ramadan, who was with the Indian embassy in Baghdad for almost 40 years. He is another gem of a person who worked above and beyond the call of duty. So these are some of the instances I thought I'll just mention to give you a little more flavor of the thing. And well, stuff does happen. Sometimes somebody said you can use the other word also. I said, you can use the other word. I was provoked to give this title because all these things just happen. Many times these are not planned, but they do have an effect. For example, after the Baghdad, the Iraq-Iran war, when all this happened, when I was involved, we had to evacuate 10,000 Indians, which we did in 10 days, with 2 young third secretaries assisting the Iraqis at the border. One was Dayakar and the other was Rajit Mittal, both of whom retired as ambassadors. But that was the beginning of the government looking at how do we deal with all this huge and expanding Indian diaspora that is there in this region. And now, of course, we were always prepared. But at that time, the whole business of my more or less getting attacked was a terse two-line message that we had got saying, Government of India does not visualize any evacuation of Indians. Do your best to see that these people stay. That was the instruction from Delhi. Without realizing that when the Iraq-Iran war started, civil aviation space over Baghdad was closed. There was bombing taking place by Iranian jets all over. We had 20,000 Indian workers. They were all feeling trapped. How are we going to get out? So that was but now things are different. So I think I've spoken far too long. Just thank you again.
Oh, that's great. So to begin the interaction, there are some questions which came to mind as you were speaking and I saw here. You know, you never shared with me how many languages you picked up on the way. So I was a bit taken aback, the number of. Now, what do you feel? I entirely agree with you that knowing the local language makes a tremendous difference for a diplomat interacting with the. Can this be systematized? You know, now with modern technology, a condensed course for at least conversing in the local language can be given to our diplomats when they are posted to foreign missions?
I think it absolutely needs to be done because many missions, many embassies, many governments actually have a program where they send at least the ambassador for a couple of months incognito to the mission he is going to so that he first learns the language and he's at least got familiarity with both the tonal quality of the language and the colloquial way. You don't want to make them great experts in the language, but enough to be able to make things. And yes, definitely it is. And I found it a great asset because when you know the language of a country where you're posted and you can actually converse in it good enough to make yourself understood and understand what's being said, you stop being a foreigner. They start looking at you as one of them, and you end up getting a lot of information which you would never get otherwise. I formally learned spoken Arabic in Damascus, although I could speak Arabic in Baghdad, but that was picked up. all the languages I learned, I actually took classes in. But I only did spoken Arabic because at that stage I thought it will be too much to now start learning how to write. So, and the only place where the spoken Arabic was available was the Alliance Francaise, where they said you take an exam in French before we can admit you to the course, which was not a problem. I did that. When I went to actually the first class, the professor, the lady, she said, I don't know why you come to listen to learn this Arabic, because I can only teach you the Damascene dialect of Arabic. Arabic as it is spoken in Damascus, which is very different from slightly different from Arabic spoken in rest of Syria, and certainly greatly different from Arabic spoken in the rest of the Arab world, to the extent, in fact, Qatari can probably barely understand colloquial Arabic of a Moroccan, because the language has taken much from both contiguous countries and old colonial powers. So this is what happened. And I was telling one of my Syrian friends that, now I'm, and the class, I give you an instance, the class was on basis of icons, I mean, we were told, and it was total immersion. I was not allowed to use any. So there's one episode between two housewives, one asking the other that, do you put parsley in stuffed courgette? I mean, she's talking about the recipe, that in Arabic it's hattullo baddunis bil kusamashi. So this whole thing was to give us an understanding of typical Damascene expressions. So this is a typical Damascene expression which he said in reply. The other housewife, she says, yo, shu halaki, meaning what the hell are you saying? That's really the translation. So I was telling my Syrian friend that, this is what I'm taught. So he said, why the hell do you want to learn this? I said, no, it's, if Farooq Shara one day tells me that give Kashmir to Pakistan, I'll say, yo, shu halaki. So anyway, language is an important thing. I think I would say that if it is, one misses a tremendous dimension to a country if you don't take the trouble to, you have to take trouble, because it doesn't just happen. You can pick up a lot of languages easily, but that's, as I have compared, like playing squash.
No, second, I wanted to ask, when a situation is developing and it's going to be a complex problem coming on the horizon, what has been your experience about reception and response from Delhi? Because when we were in Colombo, I saw this situation deteriorating, and just before this 83, I came here. I left 2 days before all hell broke loose in Colombo for a private visit. And when I went back, I was accused of having had information which I didn't share, because my brother was in research analysis wing. So everybody said, you knew this was going to happen. But I found, and I talked to my own deputy director, had resigned from the export board and gone over to the militants in Jaffna. So when that kind of thing happened, I tried to, in Delhi, convey a lot of concern. And I was dismissed as, being a victim of localitis or whatever you gentlemen call. So I found that it was very difficult to convey how difficult and complex the situation was. And you remember when the delegation came, and at dinner at your house, they had done a great agreement at a secretariat level, but I said that, it's not going to work, and I was very adversely commented upon. So did you feel that very often an ambassador or head of mission has difficulty conveying the seriousness of a deteriorating situation?
Well, it varies from country to country.
No, because you have been on both sides.
Yes.
You must have treated the missions when you were secretary here.
Exactly.
So what is the, in your experience, what happens?
Well, my experience, let me compare a small place like Cyprus, where I found that the only thing that the government or the ministry was concerned about was, are they with us on Kashmir or not? Of course, Cyprus was 100% with us. So nobody, the joint secretary concerned, was not really interested in what I did. So I said, this is great. This was like a lab for me since it was my first posting as ambassador. I said, all the things I kept thinking, if I was ambassador, I'll do this or I'll not do this. I said, let me try it all out. So there I had a free hand. But in Sri Lanka, I found in that particular case, it all actually, in a way, it started with us. I mean, there was the brewing Tamil Sinhala thing going on, but Tamil Sinhala riots in Sri Lanka have been cyclical. I mean, since 58 it goes on. This was the first time that what was anti-Tamil, it became anti-Indian. Why did it happen? Because in June, all this thing erupted on 23rd July 1983. In June, Mrs. Gandhi had conveyed our concern at what was happening in Jaffna, where the army had burnt the Jaffna library and some people had been killed. Once that concern was expressed, then of course the Sri Lankan media, especially the Sinhala media, went to town over it. And I was reporting back and I was getting briefs. I would go to the then Foreign Minister, Mr. Hamid, to tell him what we genuinely felt. Mr. Hamid, next day, the verbatim conversation of my meeting with Hamid was in the Attha, the Sinhala newspaper. Obviously, by the time things reached where those 13 soldiers were killed, it just could not be stopped. Because all the pent up, I think that came out fairly well, but it always happens that I think there's always a lag. Take the case of this Iraq thing. When whatever happened to me and I stopped, I mean, I could have actually got killed that day, came back to office, I told the then ambassador, I said, this is not working. We have to send a message to Delhi to enable us to evacuate these people, because 20,000 people dying to get out and you have no way to do anything about it. So he said, kya karna hai? I said, you have to send a message to Indira Gandhi. It's not going to happen otherwise. So in fact, a message was sent to Indira Gandhi with great trepidation. No acknowledgement came of the message, but within 24 hours we had a crisis management committee, we had planes placed, everything. A month later, a kind of a message came from the then Foreign Secretary, basically saying, was it really necessary to send a message to Indira Gandhi? So this is the problem, that people sitting here sometimes feel that...
No, you see, because of certain, I was actually advising, and my minister was Lalit Atlud Mudali, and he was doubling as internal security minister. Right. And people who would drop in were Lakshman Jaikodi and even the great Anura, yes, who didn't make it good. So we were getting a lot of information, both from the Tamil side as well as from this. And I had reached the conclusion by 82, 83 that reconciliation is impossible. That the policies followed from Colombo were so highly discriminatory that a compromise didn't appear to be. The second was that I found that whatever action was being taken from Delhi, they were treating LTTE as representing the Tamil community, which was not correct. At that time, I think your figures may be better than mine. LTTE had killed more Tamil leaders than Sinhala leaders by then. And they had decimated all the democratic elements in the Tamil community. And we should have been careful about that. And I don't think that TULF and others got proper support from. No. Then later, when the Trincomalee government was set up, yes, the hapless Perumal got no support from India.
No, and also he was undermined by the LTT.
Exactly.
But these are two cases where I happened to get involved. One was, there are comparative cases, Sri Lanka and Cyprus. Because here are two ways the two neighboring countries, India and Turkey, have tried to deal with the situation. Both have really failed in a way, because we tried to enter there, sent our army, all in support of Tamil rights. As of now, that matter is still open. In Turkey, I mean, in the Turkey-Cyprus case, exactly the other thing that people keep talking about here said, why don't we invade? Turkey actually invaded and divided the island. And today, they are in deep trouble because the Turkish part of Cyprus, which is still controlled by Turkey, is not part of the EU. Whereas the Greek part of the Cyprus is part of the EU, that is where the EU border is. And there is no way that the Greeks are now going to allow the Turks to come in unless some, and I don't see what can happen. So both solutions failed. And my conclusion on this is that when there is a polarization of minority and majority, because if you take Sri Lanka, there is a minority which has a majority complex. Same thing in Cyprus. And there is a majority which has a minority complex. The reason is very simple. 5 million Tamils in Sri Lanka think we may be 5 million, but just 28 miles across, there are 70 million Tamils sitting there behind us. The same thing with the Turkish Cypriots. They may be now about 2 million, but behind them there are 70 million Turks. And one heard the same thing from the Greek Cypriots and the Sinhalese, that after all, where are we going to go? We can't go into the sea. So this is really what...
Let me not monopolize here if there are any. Yes.
So my greetings to you on the beautiful book. I like the title, Stuff Happens. As you rightly said, many things happen. It sounds like love happens. We had a Punjabi writer, famous writer, Amrita Pritam. When she was writing her autobiography, this is autobiographical basically. So she asked the Grand Sardar Khushwant Singh what title I should give to the book. So he asked her a question, how many men do you have besides beyond marriage in your life? She said, just one. He said, well, this one name you can write, behind the revenue stamp. So that was the title, that is the title of her autobiography, The Revenue Stamp. What I want to ask you is that are there some such romantic anecdotes in diplomacy in this?
Wait for the second book. I think we'll await the second book.
Yeah, next volume of the book, next volume is called More Stuff Happens.
Anyone from this side? How is Jyoti ji quiet today? I don't understand. Jyoti, where are you sitting, or she left?
Jyoti is left.
Yeah, Tarun?
I wanted to ask about economic and commercial work. In my experience of working with you, you were very focused, very supportive when we reached out to you. And many of you were colleagues. But there was a time when economic and commercial work in the embassies was apparently, at least seemed to us, maybe wrongly, but looked down upon. The real focus was political, strategic, whatever. Can you talk about that? Have you seen some change in your lifetime, in your experience? Because the way we see it, economy gives you strength. If you have a strong economy, you can have a strong foreign policy and foreign relations. But a weak economy, in the same way, your influence is much less. So, what was the process? What happened in the years of your service in terms of attitudes towards economic and commercial work?
Thank you. Actually, everything changed because when I joined service, we had a single point agenda, which was to look for aid. The Aid India Consortium was the primary. When I retired, we were giving grants to various countries. But how did it change? One part or dimension of this entire liberalization process, which I have written about, but I got mildly or marginally involved in it, was in '91. The then Foreign Secretary, actually Mani Dixit, wrote a letter to all the ambassadors saying that now we have liberalized economy, we need to have different ways of looking at economic and commercial relations. So I remember writing to him saying that you can't do that unless you change the manual of instructions for India's commercial representatives abroad. This had been prepared in 1968, which only emphasized self-sufficiency, import substitution, all this kind of thing. Because now the requirement is that your commercial officers will have to know what are the sources for import, what are the sources for investment. So you have to revise this. Soon enough, I found that I and Anwar Hoda were asked to do the revision of this thing, which we did. And since then, it has been revised many times. But as we moved from 90s, in the 2000s, it has become much more prolific, because my job in San Francisco, which I thank you for sending me there, I first thought it might be a bit of a holiday from Turkey. But it was not, because apart from, we were under US sanctions at that time after a nuclear test, and there was a great desire to do some advocacy for our nuclear test. But apart from that, the greatest knowledge I got was the whole information technology thing, which I really got involved with it and got to know all our Indian greats in Silicon Valley, because think that that was the knowledge economy, as people talked about. And Silicon Valley was the sanctum sanctorum of that knowledge economy. And who was doing the things there? Indians. And that's why at that time it was commonplace to say that if you really want to start, have a startup, you need this one, you need that one, but you need one Indian with an unpronounceable name, because most of them were from either Tamil Nadu or Andhra. So I think that the connection, there was a great anger actually among the Indians in Silicon Valley. Why was that? Because Jaswant Singh was the head of an IT task force, which gave 183 about recommendations of what we should do about information technology. None of the people in Silicon Valley was consulted. So in fact, in October 1998, when Montek came to give a lecture there was tremendous hostility. And I thought to myself, I have to do something to change this. It took me almost 8 months to wear down that hostility. And finally, thanks to the Prime Minister's office saying that we want you select 6 or 7 people who have the time, inclination to come and build the Indian. And that was so, the fact that I took this much interest was also because this was really the bread and butter issue as far as India was concerned. Similarly, the other one is the whole oil diplomacy part of it. I have to thank Mani, who's sitting back there, who just before I went to Brussels suggested that I should go to his ministry as his advisor. I mean, he had written a letter. I eventually did go to Brussels. But oil diplomacy is another thing where I found, how did it change? In Azerbaijan, when I was ambassador in Turkey, Azerbaijan had their first oil conference and they were going to have a lot of oil from the BT gas pipeline. Mr. Ramamurthy, then Minister of Oil, came there. And those days we had something called the Empowered Committee, which decided how much money to invest. And the Empowered Committee then only allowed $20 million. Now, $20 million for oil investment is less than peanuts. So this was our vision. But later I got involved in, quite closely involved with Mr. Atul Chandra, who is sitting there, in the ONGC's purchase of the Talisman 25% share in the Greater Nile oil project in Sudan. I had to make 3 trips there to push the political side of it because the Malaysians were giving us grief. So this is what, this is how things changed, and I presume they are the same and lots of such things are happening. But in the end, what will happen will depend on how resilient the country is within itself. How good are your policies at this time to encourage? And there I think I hear many different voices.
And how much you are willing to engage. The problem arises that one is that, missions have also to add the corporate sector of India and project it, because government with its procedures and budgetary constraints cannot pick up all the items of international cooperation. This is where the mood in the presentation or the work of the embassy need to change. On that IT thing, if you remember, that the first delegation that was organized out of California got short shrift here.
Yes.
And despite all the dispatches from San Francisco and from Washington, it was very difficult to arrange meetings for them. And that was, I think, 99.
99.
99.
That's
And it took, after 3-4 years, the
Yeah.
tide changed. There was the response in the beginning.
By 2000, things had changed here because that was the condition on which these people went, that we must get all our appointments, including with Prime Minister. He got. And then when he came, he met them. So
A
things
lot of
did
phone
change.
calls were required, but things have changed since then. That's
So
true.
I see Nengcha sitting here, who is the Dean of our Foreign Service Institute. So I suppose she is going to teach the young people who are joining about the importance of economic work.
Yeah, please.
Ambassador Abhyankar, how do you look at the Indo-Iraqi relations? Because you were the ambassador in Iraq. And I remember that during Vajpayee's government, the oil minister went to Iraq and had a meeting with Mr. Saddam Hussein that time. And after that, we find after 20 years, recently our foreign minister was in Iraq. Now, how do you look at the future? Because American interests are so deep in Iraq, oil-wise. So how do you look at the future of Indo-Iraqi relations?
Thank you, Vijay. Let me just say I was never ambassador in Iraq. I was the number 2. So just to set the record straight. I think I have been writing that we should have been connecting with Iraq a long time ago. What happened, I'm very glad that Salman Khurshid went even for one day, but at least that connection was made. Because Mr. Atul Chandra will also vouch for this. We had 2 outstanding blocks given to us. Okay, let me take one step back. Iraq and Iran used to, between them, provide all our oil requirements till 1980. And there is no reason why this can be the same from here on in, now that Iraq's production. Iraq today is our second largest supplier, although we have had to scale down our Irani imports. But sooner or later things should change, or we should see what our interest is. Both countries are perfectly capable, because of their reserve, to meet. But it's not just oil. I mean, oil is of course the requirement right now, and I'm glad that the connection has been made. We had one block number 8, which is next to the Rumaila field, which is a highly productive block, and the other one at Tuba. ONGC actually had put some money in there, and Reliance now has got some contract up in Kurdistan. Right now the problem is Iraqi. The Iraqi Kurdistan government and the central government of Baghdad have not yet come to any agreement on who is going to actually be the master of giving contracts and how is the revenue going to be shared. But sooner or later, I suppose they'll have to do it. Meanwhile, companies are going ahead and investing. But the other thing that they have now done is that earlier there were what are called production sharing contracts. They now just want service contracts, meaning they don't want you to be a partner. They just want you to come and drill. And they want all these contracts changed. So that is, I think, what the cogitation is going on as far as. But I think that this relationship is important because it's not just the oil, as I said, it's a long relationship with Iraq. Don't forget that Iraq was administered from Bombay in the British times. The Basra pearls, I think our mothers would probably remember that Basra pearls were the pearls that people would die for. Unfortunately, those pearl shipments have gone, but there are Indian troops have, there are graves, all these places like Kut, Amara, Bakuba, which you keep hearing in Al Jazeera and in CNN, these are known to us for decades. There's Indian blood which has been spilled there. We have a long-standing relationship, and as I mentioned earlier, that regardless of who's there in power, I think the feeling for India is absolutely very positive.
I think in the Ministry of Petroleum and ONGC had very good relations. Yeah. In fact, after the Americans moved in and all salaries were not coming, I believe ONGC was funding the officers in the Ministry of Petroleum and Baghdad to carry on. So I think that goodwill needs to be encashed now in some way.
I'm glad we got cold feet in 2005. 2003 firstly was the principle of it, that although there was a government which was transitional and then an elected government, we continued to take the view that, you know, Iraq is occupied and we don't want to get involved with it. That's why we never sent an ambassador. Then eventually in 2005, some Indian drivers who are carrying petrol, they got kidnapped. I think we had to ransom them out. At that stage, we decided, kuch nahi karna hai.
Security issues are there.
Now I'm glad that we, at least I hope that this will not be a flash in the pan, but something more.
Kiranji, what's your question, or is it a... Okay, good.
I think it's time to...
Ambassador Abhyankar, you've obviously stuff happens and challenges come, and you seem to have enjoyed your challenges as you've gone through your career. Looking at what's happening in the world today, if you had the choice, you were given a choice, let's presume firstly, you're in service. Let's also presume that you have the privilege of choosing where you will go to serve. What country would you choose and why in today's world?
That's an excellent question, and I have an excellent reply for you. You know where I'd like to go as ambassador? To Saudi Arabia. Not because of oil, because we have had this long-standing sort of self-denying, call it self-denying decision or ordinance, that we will never send a Hindu to Saudi Arabia as ambassador. Other countries who are not Hindus, who may not be Muslim, send whoever is the best qualified ambassador, because there is diplomacy to be done. It is, of course, I accept that for your consul general in Jeddah, you would have to send a Muslim because of the Hajj, and you have to be able to go to Mecca, but not so for the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So why not break the thing and break that mold? Why not think out of the box? Send the best person. There is Saeed Naqvi raising his finger.
Yeah, Saeed sir.
No, that is a subject of this I've written. Why should we not send a non-Muslim? It is ridiculous that we should have this taboo that only a Muslim will be appointed to Saudi Arabia. But there's another issue I wanted to raise with you, Ambassador Abhyankar. Hello? When the occupation of Iraq, when the war began, some of us in the media, me particularly, I was worried that Indian media does not cover these events, that we are the only people who are willing to take it up, that a team of Indian journalists should position itself in various places in the Middle East and cover the occupation of Iraq. Constantly we were told that market does not allow it. People are not interested. When we positioned ourselves and covered the Iraq war from 2002 to 2003-04, we discovered that the TRP ratings for that particular program beat the TRP ratings for Kaun Banega Crorepati by Amitabh Bachchan. So it completely, the fallacy of the argument that audiences are not interested in foreign affairs. Now it was done and it was a successful operation. Why do you think, and you were very instrumental in, you fought with people, said no, this should be done. Why can that not be taken up, you think?
Well, before I get to that, about breaking taboos, you remember there was a taboo also that we'd never have a Sikh as a chief of the army staff. General Harbakh Singh was not made. General Vikram Singh was not made. We have broken that taboo. Therefore, why not break yet another taboo and put the best man whoever may be, at least in Riyadh.
It's actually tokenism, and I don't want to dilate.
Okay, let's now about the third eye. Actually, what he is referring to was we did set up a channel to project the war in Iraq as it was going on, the invasion. And that particular program was called The Third Eye. Our ministry supported it. But at some point in time, actually, it fell flat for, one was maybe there are people who didn't want it, but let's leave that aside. It is an expensive business, having your own channel. because we checked with Prasar Bharati, they said you can go to DD2 if I am not mistaken, which is at night. And this is the cost, and it was coming to tens of crores for a whole year. And then everybody chickened out. While it was just one program, it was fine to get a slot, but to do it on a regular basis, but it definitely needs to be done. And even more so now, because I think after the American invasion of Iraq, and since, let's say, 2000, since the last 10 years, a lot of foreign policy issues have come out on the streets of India. I mean, you've seen demonstrations against one or the other side. People are taking much more interest in what happens. So I think somebody needs to do it. I saw yesterday a program on CNBC, which is called Foreign Policy Classroom or something like that, where somebody has got a program for half an hour on different issues, including some of the ones we have discussed today, as a matter of educating the public about the various dimensions of foreign policy and how it affects the common man. But the real point here is that foreign policy, in our perception, tends to get seen as something different. After all, foreign policy is just one instrument that the government has to achieve its national goals. I have never clearly seen an enunciation of what are India's national goals. But if I was to actually summarize, in one sentence, it would be to maintain the prosperity and security of the Indian people. I mean, then one can break it down in. So if that is the goal, how do you maintain if you come down to Indians as 1.3 billion, what does that mean? It means enhancing the capabilities of our people. And this is, foreign policy is just one instrument. So if you see planning commission documents, plan documents, I have not seen any clear enunciation. Where does the foreign policy fit into achieving some of the objectives of the 5-year plans or our economic objectives? There is no such thing. That I may have missed it perhaps, but I have myself not seen. And it all boils down to that. Once you start harnessing the tools as a tool for attaining something, then.
Actually, Shyam is working on it now.
Good. That's great.
I think he was here.
Yeah.
And it's gone out. So what you say is quite correct. I think if the hour is approached, there is hardly any need for me to. I find Mani is uncharacteristically very quiet. Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer, can I request you please to say something?
I'm playing door role in Bombay next week, so I don't want to shoot my goals.
All right. I think that's a good distinction, because I was looking at you again and again. But so I think we have had a very lively discussion. I thank Rajendra for the privilege he has given me today. But once or twice in this thing, I have, whether it is administration, whether it is foreign policy, internal security, the circumstances have a life of their own, and if we don't anticipate things, you are caught. And I'm very glad that you have focused on the unusual. And it is the unusual which brings out what needs to be done and what is the best way to manage issues. I was particularly impressed with your thing on languages, and the way you made the scene come alive first and then the anecdote. So it is very properly and richly presented. I think we will look forward to a second book from you. And,
yes, sir. I just want to mention, sir, that why is this minaret on the cover? I don't know if any one of you actually. This is probably the only minaret of any mosque in the world which has the 6-pointed Star of David on it.
I see.
Because it dates from the time when the Umayyad Mosque was a Jewish temple.
Right.
This really encapsulates the unusual nature of the kind of stuff that has been going on in my career, but also in the world.
No, ultimately, I think we may divide ourselves in community, religions and all that, but I think ultimately one hopes that humanity will assert itself. So with this, I thank
Thank
you
you,
all.
sir.